He can hear us. Sho, we're saying good things about you. I hope you can hear that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Are you able to hear me okay?
Oh,
Yeah,
yes,
great.
I can hear you.
Oh,
Excellent.
wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so honored that you invited me. So thank you so much.
I think
It's
Alan's
really-
going to get you up on the screen, and we're going to let you take it away, okay?
You can go ahead, Shomari.
You're on.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's really an honor to be here discussing Black Fortunes with you. And I'm so glad that some of you had the opportunity to read it, and even those who are waiting to crack it open, hopefully I can entice you to dive into some of these stories because they really are, extraordinary, the true stories of extraordinary people. What I first thought about when I wanted to write this book is I just really wanted to tell the story of Black wealth in the Black economy and how that came to be. African Americans were emancipated by Abraham Lincoln without, much to build a life with. No land, no money. And somehow we went from there to here. And in between, you had extraordinary individuals, extraordinary industrialists, Black industrialists, who were able to build the foundation and help build some early Black communities and early Black financial sectors. It really made a difference, in the life of Black America. And if it's okay, can I go ahead and share my screen here?
Yes, you should be.
Okay, great. I have a presentation here to share with you guys. Sorry about that. Great. Okay. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to start the presentation. That is. Sorry, start at the end of the presentation. Okay, there we go. So my name is Shomari Wills, and I'm the author of Black Fortunes, the story of the first 6 African Americans who escaped slavery and became millionaires. And so my book is basically, as I was speaking about just before I got the slideshow started, it was about the very first African Americans that came directly out of slavery or right after emancipation and were able to build these incredible fortunes. And it was not easy. Many of them faced death, attempts on their life, attempts to defraud them, steal their fortunes. Some of them even lost their fortunes. And along the way, they were really able to change the world by helping to bring about the Civil War, by fighting for desegregation of public transportation, by building some of the first great Black cities like Memphis, Tennessee, Beale Street, the birthplace of the blues. And they really had a tremendous impact on society, even though we don't know many of their names. So I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about their story and, exactly what they went through to build their fortunes. So the story starts with William Leidesdorff. William Leidesdorff was a free mulatto man or Black man in New Orleans during the antebellum era. And as you can see, this is the closest thing to an actual picture we have of him. He was fair enough to maybe even pass for white. And his story starts when he was courting the daughter of a white Creole French aristocrat in New Orleans, and they were in love. And he wanted to marry her and build his life with her. And what happened essentially was that right before they got married, she was not aware that he was black. Her family was not aware that she was black. And he confessed to her right before their wedding that he was actually a black man. And so she told her father, and of course, they had to break off the engagement. And as the legend goes, she died of a broken heart. So William Leidesdorff, he left New Orleans and he went to California. But at that point, in the early 1840s, California was actually part of Mexico. And he actually became one of the early developers of Mexico. He was an importer of all sorts of things like coffee, tobacco, and he actually became an ambassador to Mexico while he was there in the 1840s. He built up a tremendous relationship with the Mexican government, and they ended up gifting him about 400 acres of land, which actually roughly approximately would be close to all of Sacramento, California today. William Leidesdorff tragically died shortly after that. And a few years after his death, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California. And with that discovery, the land that he owned, this 400 acres, became close to one of the most valuable pieces of property in the United States, making his estate worth millions and millions of dollars. He left his estate to his mother, who was a black woman who lived in the Caribbean, and she ended up getting swindled out of her fortune. She happened to be illiterate, and she was asked to sign contracts that she wasn't exactly sure what they said. And she ended up losing her land to, a white industrialist. But William Leidesdorff, many of us don't know his name, but I believe he was actually the earliest black millionaire, becoming a millionaire before the Civil War even begun. So if we fast forward a little bit to Massachusetts in the early 1840s, we get to Mary Ellen Pleasant. Mary Ellen Pleasant grew up on the island of Nantucket in the early 1800s, 1820s, 1830s. And she grew up working in a store in Nantucket. Nantucket was a free territory, as Massachusetts was a free state, one that didn't have slavery. And she grew up working in this general store in Nantucket. But something special was happening in Nantucket at the time. Many of us have read Moby Dick, and we realize that the whaling industry in the United States created a tremendous boom. Whales were hunted for their blubber, which was then refined down into an oil that powered heating lamps and powered lanterns, and basically was the petroleum of the 19th century. So Nantucket was the whaling capital of the world when she was growing up, working in this general store. So she was seeing whalers come in and out of the store, people coming to Nantucket, working on whaling ships, making small fortunes, and it kind of became an informal business education for her. So when she became older, she moved off to Boston and moved back to the mainland of Massachusetts in Boston, married a wealthy man there. And he passed away a few years after they were married, and he left her a small fortune, not a great fortune. And what she decided to do was to take it and go to California. Because right around this time, 1849, which we mentioned earlier, the gold rush was happening in California. And so Mary Ellen Pleasant decided to pack up all her things and move to California. There, she was able to shrewdly take the small fortune she had inherited from her late husband and invest in various businesses in what was quickly becoming a boomtown in San Francisco with the gold rush. She had businesses from money lending businesses to caterers. She had a boarding house or a high-end hotel, laundromats, which were big business back then. And she was able to build a tremendous fortune and actually ended up using some of her fortune to fund John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which helped bring about the Civil War. And all throughout her life, she always used her money to help advance the cause of equality for Black people. Fast forward a little bit to William Reed Church. He was born a slave. He was the son of an enslaved Black woman and a white steamship captain. He was raised as a servant or a body servant or a slave aboard his father's ship, meaning he was his father's own personal slave. He grew up on this ship. It was a steamboat ship that went up and down the Mississippi, hauling cotton. And along the way, there were performances, there was gambling. It was really a crossover of just raucous entertainment and mercantilism as the ship brought the cotton up and down the Mississippi that was being grown on Southern plantations. When the Civil War started, his father's ship was commandeered by the Confederacy. And so when that happened, he went from being his father's personal slave and servant to being a forced enlistee in the Confederate Army. So he worked on this ship, continued to work on his ship, under the watchful eye of the Confederate Army until one day he jumped off the ship, swam the Freedom, and washed up on the shores of Memphis, Tennessee. In Memphis, he was able to build a life for himself. He built businesses like hotels and gambling halls and pool halls, and he also became a big-time real estate developer. He made his fortune during the yellow fever epidemic in Memphis in the 1870s. There were two separate yellow fever epidemics. And so, we all know how crazy, things can get, when you have an infectious disease spreading and, people are panicked. And, basically all the wealthy folks in Memphis decided to leave town during the yellow fever epidemics. And he actually ended up buying up most of their property for pennies on the dollar and became one of the largest landowners in Memphis, Tennessee. And he used his real estate holdings to build Beale Street, which is still there today, and which became the birthplace of the blues. During his life, he made several contributions funding. Ida B. Wells was a benefactor of his. He was a donor to Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt administration, and he always advocated for Black folks and for equality. And, he just lived a tremendous, tremendous life. One of the most interesting anecdotes about him is he was actually nearly killed during race riots in Memphis in the 1870s because he was known as a Black business owner. A mob that was angry about the fact that about Reconstruction, essentially, which was a period when the federal government gave a lot of aid to former slaves, came to his business, shot him in the head, and lit his business on fire. Somehow he survived both a gunshot wound to the head, and a potential fiery grave, and he went on to build his fortune from there. So as I mentioned, so many of these folks had to overcome so much to get to where they ended up. We move on to Jeremiah Hamilton. He was a broker and a commodities and securities investor in New York in the 1860s. He was a cutthroat investor, as cutthroat as they get. He dueled with the Vanderbilts, and he became the richest Black broker in New York. As a product of the notoriety he got, both from being the richest Black broker, this millionaire in New York in the 1860s, as well as his cutthroat business tactics, he became, sort of a hated character. He became known actually as the Prince of Darkness, which was just both a sort of a pejorative racial term, but also referred to how cutthroat of an investor he was. What made him especially controversial is he was in an interracial marriage in the 1860s, right around the time the Civil War ended, which was really, really unheard of at the time, to be openly interracial marriage, especially with the man being the African American in interracial marriage. And so as a result, a mob one day marched on his house to lynch him in downtown Manhattan. And somehow he got wind of this and he was able to flee and run down a back alley to safety before the mob got to his house. And he was able to live out the rest of his life in New York and continue to invest. But Jeremiah Hamilton, he was quite the industrialist. If we move forward a little bit and also move westward, we've all heard of Black Wall Street and Tulsa and the Tulsa 1921 massacre, where this prosperous Black area known as Black Wall Street or Greenwood was destroyed by a hateful race mob. So Tulsa, the story of that actually goes back before Greenwood. Oklahoma was the product of several land runs. You know, we all know about the Oklahoma Boomers and the Oklahoma Sooners, the folks that lined up to go for actual literal land runs where they would race into Oklahoma to claim a piece of land. During one of those land runs, a man named O.W. Gurley, along with another man named John the Baptist Bradford, were able to procure a very large parcel of land in what turned out to be Tulsa. When they got the land, they didn't have any conceptions that it would be worth a tremendous amount of money. They just thought this is a place we can build a Black city, a Black town. And so they did. They built this Black town known as Greenwood, known as Tulsa. And, you know, Black folks fled there. During the early 1900s, you know, there was a lot of racial violence. There was a lot of lynching going on in the South. And Black folks fled to Tulsa. They fled to Oklahoma as a place of potential safety. Also, during that time, oil was discovered in Tulsa, and it actually became another boomtown. And so right next to Tulsa, there happened to be Greenwood. So you had this Black town that happened to be built right next to where an oil boom was occurring. And so Black Wall Street or Greenwood became very prosperous. It was full of Black middle class and Black industrialists. And, you know, it became known as one of the most prosperous Black neighborhoods, you know, in the country at the time. And this created a tremendous amount of resentment. And of course, we know how that ended with the Tulsa race riots. But I think it's also important to remember O.W. Gurley, who was a visionary early on and was able to procure the land where Black Wall Street was built. And he invested in the town and built it up. So it eventually could become something. Annie Malone, her protege, Madam C.J. Walker, is a little bit better known, or significantly better known. Annie Malone was a hair maven, a hair industrialist based in the Midwest. She was born in Illinois, but she built her business in St. Louis. She basically saw a business opportunity after the Civil War ended. Her father was a Civil War veteran. He fought on the side of the Union. And she saw an opportunity after the Civil War ended, as Black people were integrating themselves into society. She saw that Black women needed, you know, hair salons. They needed hair products. That these things didn't necessarily previously exist at scale. And so she started a line of hair products and she started a line of hair salons, and it just really, really took off. It became, you know, just a really dominant line of products in the Midwest. They were called Poro products, and you can see one of her ads I have there. She actually had a woman that worked for her for a year named Sarah Breedlove. Sarah Breedlove is better known as Madam C.J. Walker. And she borrowed very heavily from Annie Malone. And, you know, she was able to start her own line of products that, you know, rivaled Annie Malone's in terms of their success. But in terms of the originator of the Black hair industry and the first Black hair millionaire was actually Annie Malone. And she was able to, you know, help another, black woman, started a similar empire just a few years after she did, in Madam C.J. Walker. And then finally, we have Hannah Elias, who is probably the most interesting of the early black millionaires that I talk about in this book. Hannah Elias, she was kind of a scandalous person, but Hannah Elias was the mistress of a extremely wealthy New York-based industrialist, and he just heaped money on her, just at extravagant levels, and she actually was able to take that money and invest it in real estate in New York. And she actually was one of the main real estate developers that helped turn Harlem into a black neighborhood. Harlem didn't start to turn into a black neighborhood until the 1920s, 1930s. Before that, it was all white. Blacks were not even allowed to live in the neighborhood. There was talk about building a wall, actually, to prevent black folks from moving into Harlem. And she used her wealth that she got from her benefactor, so to speak, to invest in Harlem and actually turn it into a black neighborhood that became the fertile soil from which you had the Harlem Renaissance, and everything we love about Harlem today was able to come as a byproduct of that. And, lastly, I wanted to end, as we're here in Richmond, talking about Napoleon Drew. Napoleon Drew was the first black man in Powhatan, Virginia, to own property, and he was actually my great-great-great-grandfather. His son, John Drew, immigrated from Virginia to Darby, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Philadelphia. And he started a bus line, which later became part of SEPTA, the Philadelphia Metro Transit System. And he actually sold his bus line to SEPTA and became one of the first black millionaires in Philadelphia in 1829. But before that, there was his father, Napoleon Bonaparte Drew, the first black man in Powhatan to own property. He was born a slave. And, on Belmead Plantation, I don't know if anybody here has ever been to Belmead. It's a beautiful, beautiful property. But he was born a slave on Belmead property, worked there until he was 23 years old, and then he was emancipated by the Emancipation Proclamation. He worked at Belmead for a few more years and saved up money, and he was actually able to buy a plot of property nearby the Belmead Plantation, actually, where he had a farm and raised his family. And my uncle, my great-great-uncle, John Drew, who became a millionaire through his bus line, and he also owned a Negro League baseball team. My great-great-grandfather, his brother Simon, he owned a ice cream shop or an ice house where they had beer and ice cream and oysters. They actually got their money to start their businesses in Darby because their father sold the majority of his land to get them started. So, these folks, who were early black industrialists, they not only have affected, the world, through, funding John Brown or building Beale Street or helping to build Harlem, also have had a very personal impact on me. And so, I can open it up for questions. I did have a couple slides here about where black wealth stands today. And I think one thing that's really interesting is to look at, where the disparities in income versus the disparities in wealth. You can see just here the disparities that exist in, black wealth versus all other wealth or, general wealth. And some of the things that, today are causing disparities in the racial wealth disparity are lower homeownership rates, lower rates of investment in security and racial pay gaps, as well as less inherited wealth. So we've come a long way, from the foundation that was laid by, some of the early black industrialists, but there's still, a lot of work to be done. And I can go ahead and open it for questions.
Question for you, Shomari.
Absolutely. Yes.
Can we call you Sho?
Whatever you like.
That was my first question. Let's see. We do have some questions here, and I've got some of my own, and others may have questions. Can we get those cards? Where is my usher? Thank you, Steve Blanchard. Can collect some of those cards. So, Sho, what if you take your slide down off the screen so we can see your face?
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm going to read a question here. It says, while all of the stories in the book were very insightful, is there one that inspired your writing more than the others?
Yes. I'm here we go. Stop screen sharing. There we go. I really connected with the story of Mary Ellen Pleasant. She was so brilliant, and W.E. Du Bois once said of her, if she had been born a white man at the time, she would have been president. This was just a woman who just really was such a shrewd investor, and also, decided to use her wealth to help other people. She not only helped African Americans, but she was an early advocate for women in San Francisco. And she was involved in, a number of prominent women's issues. She just inspires me because she was so clever, so courageous. She still is just really a hero, for me to this day.
Okay. You have a question, David?
Well, yeah, I got one from the audience. Do you think there's any significance that 4 of the people were successful women during this era? Was it somewhat easier for black women than men to be entrepreneurially successful, or were the women just more resourceful and more able to, because of just the fewer rights and able to navigate? That's a question coming from the audience.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. There are a lot of the early black industrialists, were women. I think that it was really, speaks to, the potential and the brilliance of black women. That we think of business and we think of it as sort of a swashbuckling empire, but Annie Malone and, Mary Ellen Pleasant were able to just kind of, not necessarily through being cutthroat or being, aggressive, but, through just being, the smartest person in the room, and, seeing what business opportunities were out there, were able to, maximize, their opportunities. And I think it just speaks to the fact that, the potential of not just black women, but of women in general. And, folks like, it's probably a little more balanced than the book makes it out to be, because I did leave one character out, whose name was Alonzo Herndon. He was the first black millionaire in Atlanta, and his story was so similar to Robert Reed Church's that I didn't want to be repetitive. I do mention him in the epilogue. But, I just think that, Annie Malone and, Mary Ellen Pleasant are just a testament to the fact that women can be just as successful in business as men.
Got a question for you. How old were you when you started this mission?
Oh, man. I probably had just turned 30 when I started this. And I was working on this book for, quite some time. I started it when I was a graduate student at Columbia. And I finished the book So that was, when was that, 2012, 2011, and I finished the book in 2014. No, maybe 20. No. Okay, so I finished the book in 2016, I think, or 2017. So I was working on it quite some time.
How did you find out about the Seminoles and like them owning enslaved people and the Trail of Tears, just that whole part of history with Oklahoma?
Yeah, I think that the story of Oklahoma is really interesting, and there's a lot of good books on Oklahoma that touch on it. But I just think the black part in the Trail of Tears, um, it's not really told. You know, we all know about the Trail of Tears and how tragic it was for Native Americans to be removed from their land in the South and forced to, walk to this new place that they would call Oklahoma and relocate. But, we don't talk about the fact that these Native Americans actually had black slaves. And that as they were walking on the Trail of Tears, the people who disproportionately were hauling, the equipment and, who were, doing the heavy lifting and the heavy labor were African American slaves. And, that's not to disparage, Native Americans at all. It adds a layer of complexity to a story. And sometimes, racism can be multi-layered. And, I think the story of Oklahoma and the black story of Oklahoma, it was really such a, a place of hope and tragedy for African Americans. Yeah, it was really important for me to tell that story, or to try to tell that story.
So, if you were talking to a class of high school students, African American, who were interested in making a fortune, is there a particular field that you would advise them to go into? Are there fields in which those high school students could be more successful than others?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things I learned from, researching this story is just how opportunistic these folks were. They really kind of looked around at what was going on around them, where the opportunities were, and, they pursued that. When Mary Ellen Pleasant moved to San Francisco, she didn't have an idea of what she was going to do when she got there. But she just got there, she got on the ground, and she saw what was going on. You had a bunch of miners. The city was like 80, 90% men. There was really no infrastructure. And so she said, I know I got these rough and tumble guys here. They're going to need a place to stay. They're going to need to borrow money after they spend up all their paychecks, and they're going to need to launder their clothes. And so she started a laundromat, she started a money lending business, and she started a boarding house. And the same is for, the majority of the characters in the story. They were opportunists. They looked at where the opportunities around them were, and they pursued those. And, today I'd say it's probably, STEM, obviously, is where we see the, greatest opportunities. So certainly focusing on science and math, and, careers in engineering and computer science, certainly where I would advise somebody to look if they were following that model.
What did people do for banking with these black men and women? Did they have like white people as proxy? Did they do their own banking? How did they ensure that their money didn't get stolen?
Yeah, that's interesting. So banking was a problem. And, early on, most of them did have to commingle their funds with a white person just to be able to bank. Later on, Robert Reed Church actually started one of the first black banks. And, around the turn of the century, early 1900s, 1901, and later, black folks started creating their own banking institutions where they could, keep their mony.
Maggie Walker.
Yeah, before that, you had to find somebody who you could commingle your funds with, or, keep it in gold or, some other, semi-liquid asset.
So I was just thinking about Robert Reed Church in Memphis and thinking that like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, none of them got shot in the head and had their business burned to the ground while they were trying to make a fortune. There's significant adversity for a lot of these folks. It's not really a question, is it? But it is a comment. Would you like to comment further on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Robert Reed Church, I mean, he was an amazing, amazing guy. He had headaches his entire life because he was shot in the head during the race riots in Memphis. And they couldn't actually fully remove the bullet. And he just did the best he could with morphine and whiskey, but he still was able, even though he had these splitting headaches and, had the right certainly to be very angry about that. He was able to push forward. He never turned to hatred. Infamously, he actually reconciled and forgave a group of Confederate veterans in Memphis, and actually, raised money for them to be able to, because there was a group of Confederate veterans who were basically impoverished. He actually raised money and helped them and gave charity to them. So he was never angry about it, and everything that he had to overcome, and he also was able to achieve in spite of. So he's really an amazing guy.
My two favorite books, probably Black History books, is Black Fortune and The Warmth of Those Suns. I see both of them up there. Any further reading, would you recommend in that vein?
Yeah, Warmth of Other Suns is of course is my favorite book. In terms of Black history, I would also recommend the classics. The autobiography of Frederick Douglass is a book that I read every single year. W.E.B. Du Bois, Souls of Black Folk. Also, The Philadelphia Negro is a foundational book where he does a population level study of African Americans living in Philadelphia, and he's really able to make a lot of insights about the Black community that are still true today. In terms of other Black history books, I would recommend. I would recommend Isabel Wilkerson's second book as well as her first. Howard French has a great book called Born in Blackness, which talks about the history of the transatlantic slave trade and how that basically redefined the world. And there's just there's tons of others, but that would probably be what's front of mind for me.
I have a question here. What is a trait or theme that these 6 people had? You mentioned they were opportunistic, many of them, but business sense, real estate investment, was there any kind of unifying trait or theme?
They were able to turn their life experiences into sort of an education, even the ones that were not great. Mary Ellen Pleasant, as I mentioned, she grew up in this boomtown in Nantucket, and she was actually supposed to be going to school there. Her father sent her to Nantucket because it had one of the only Black schools in the country during the antebellum period, the slavery period. And the family he sent her to actually just took the money and put her to work in the store. But she just kind of, as she was working in that store, dealing with the whalers and, all the money that was kind of sloshing around Nantucket, she was able to kind of learn from those experiences. And so when she got to her second boomtown, Gold Rush, San Francisco, she really hit the ground running. And all these folks were able to do the same. When Robert Reed Church was a slave on his father's riverboat, he learned about the entertainment industry, because these riverboats, they had gambling, they had, bands that were playing. They had dancers, all sorts of stuff. And some more, sort of red light activity. And he learned about entertainment. And so when he got to Memphis and he was able to get some money and start his own business, he had a pool hall. It was also a dance hall. He had a bar. He had a hotel. So he was able to take this experience where he was a slave on this, kind of floating palace, this floating, casino almost. And he was able to take that experience and use that as sort of an education. And, they all had that trait that even when they were in a bad situation where they were sometimes literally enslaved, they still were learning and gathering information that they would use later on to help lift themselves up.
I wanted to ask you about a theme that kind of runs through the book. We live in a nation that, for whatever reason, has placed value on whiteness, which seems completely arbitrary to me. It could have been just the other way around. But whiteness is valued in this part of the world, and it broke my heart to read about the women who were trying to straighten their hair or lighten their skin, often with chemical burns and hair loss. And you mentioned some of the six could have passed for white, and I wonder how that might have made a difference in terms of their opportunity. And I saw again and again how that theme kind of crept into the book. Here are black people trying to make it in a white world, and whiteness is valued. They had to overcome that, some of them, and others not so successfully.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for the ones that could pass, it did give them a degree of mobility, a degree of protection. And they used it to their advantage. And I think the key with them is that they didn't decide to just disappear and kind of use the fact that they could, pass as a white person to, kind of just fade into the background. They used it to procure, assets that they use for, the good of their own community. Early on in the book, right after emancipation, you can see, how these powerful themes of, colorism and, looking, whiter or being more fair skinned or having straighter hair, they were valued to a certain extent. And, it is a tragic thing about the book. Annie Malone, she actually was sort of a reaction to that. Because you had a lot of these companies selling really toxic hair straighteners and skin lighteners, and black women were just hurting themselves with these things. And she created a line of beauty products that were healthy and that also embraced, black beauty and a black aesthetic. And she was able to, sort of push back, on sort of the darker, forces of, colorism and, that were present in the country.
It seems crazy to me because it is so arbitrary. But I had a church member in Washington, D.C. who was from India, and she said, yeah, in India they sell these beauty products called Fair and Lovely, which are supposed to make dark-skinned people lighter. And then in this country, we've got all the white people going to the beach and putting on suntan lotion so they can get darker skin. And, somebody just needs to put their foot down at some point and say, it doesn't have to matter at all. It doesn't have to. It does. It doesn't have to. And so I was kind of impressed by some of the people you wrote about who said, okay, it doesn't matter to me. That's not what this is about. It's about opportunity. It's about industry. It's about working hard. It's about seizing what can be seized. And some of them just defied the odds and rose above the color barrier in a way that was inspiring.
Absolutely.
So, Shomari, what did you hope the book would be the product of your writing? What did you hope your book would do in the world?
Sorry, good. One more time. Sorry.
What did you hope that your book would accomplish in the world? Like with you putting that work in, what was your desired outcome of that?
I wanted people to have a more nuanced understanding of Black history and, of Black economics. Black poverty is it's a tremendous problem. It's a tremendous problem, both now and throughout history. Most African Americans, when they were emancipated from enslavement, they had nothing. And they were impoverished, and we still have unacceptable levels of Black poverty today. I wanted to add a layer to that conversation because Black poverty is not ubiquitous, and it's also it's not certain. It's not a certain outcome. And I wanted to show folks that there were Black people that had made it and built themselves up, and that we had, as African Americans, we had built industries and built cities and for ourselves, and that it wasn't just a one-note story about poverty and lack. That there was also a lot of accomplishment. There was also a lot of assiduousness. There was also a lot of industry within Black history, and that still exists now. And I just wanted to add another layer to the conversation that was occurring about Black history, and Black economics.
Have we covered the questions that have been turned in? Anybody else have a question that we didn't get? That Sandra has one. Hold on.
Shomari, what does your world look like now? And are you doing any more writing? And what's your kind of vocational scenario?
Yeah, so right now I'm working on a couple of books. One is a sort of sequel to Black Fortunes. One's a sort of different sort of book. And I'm also working on getting Black Fortunes turned into a television miniseries. Been working on that with Stephanie Elaine from Dear White People for the past couple of years. So still working on that. And just really focused on my second book as well.
Great.
So here's a question from my friend Sandra. She says, how many Black millionaires do we have today, and in what fields are they working?
I don't know the exact amount, but I believe it's at least 50,000. It might be closer to 100,000. And it would be depending. It would depend on how you define that. If you were just talking about net worth and wealth, most of that would be real estate. Because gentrification has created a phenomenon where a lot of previously red areas, a lot of red-lined areas, a lot of previously Black neighborhoods that were, not super highly valued in cities are now starting to go up in value. So the Black people that held on to their homes, a lot of those folks have become millionaires overnight. But if you were if you were not to factor in real estate, I would guess that, the largest group of, Black millionaires would probably be, folks that are working at the high end of healthcare, surgeons, cardiologists, anesthesiologists, as well as maybe, finance. Folks in finance as well.
What about sports and entertainment?
Yeah, 100%. That's the obvious one. That's the most visible one. But it's not, certainly not comparable to like, you have a lot of Black folks on Wall Street these days. I think 2% of investment bankers are Black now, which is not high enough, but it's certainly a big change. And sports and entertainment is a big part of it. But, I think in terms of raw numbers, just people that own homes in high-end, valuable areas, and as well as folks in finance and medicine might be a little bit bigger.
So I had an interesting question before we got started tonight. Somebody was talking about, here's a book that chronicles the accumulation of wealth by African American people shortly after slavery. What's it for? What do we do with the wealth that we accumulate? And that's a different kind of question. But maybe going forward, as you look toward your next book or books, it's one thing to accumulate wealth. It's another to use it in a way that is uplifting and honorable and maybe makes the world a better place. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I won't spoil the ending of the book for folks that haven't read it yet, but there's one particular character who loses their fortune at the end of their life. They basically are impoverished at the end of it. And it was, one of the main reasons they lost their fortune is because they basically used it all, helping other people. And a lot of folks will kind of approach me about that, and say, hey, that was so sad. I cried when I read that part. It was sad for me too. But it's also kind of like an awe-inspiring moment to see this person that just basically gave everything away they had to help other people. And it would have been great if she could have kept a little bit for herself, or I don't mean to spoil it, but if they had kept a little bit for themselves, certainly that would have been, that would have been nice. But, when they died, they said they were satisfied because they had given everything away to help other people. And to me, that is a sad part of the book, but it's also probably the most inspiring personally to me. And I hope other folks find it inspiring as well.
Thank you so much. Shomari, do you have any closing comments before we let you go?
No, I'm just really grateful to be here. And I'm grateful that you guys did that you guys selected Black Fortunes to read and to discuss. I'm really honored by that. And, I'm happy if you have any questions that you think of after the session, just at me on Twitter, at Show Wills, SHOWILLS. And I'm interested to hear, what people got out of the book and what stuck out. And, let me know what you thought of the ending. Did you cry or did you smile at the end? I'm always interested to hear.
I had one more question for you. Being from Richmond, Maggie L. Walker is a prominent person here. And so growing up, I heard she was the first Black female millionaire. Where does she fit into the story of all of these people?
Did you say Madam C.J. Walker, or I didn't hear what the name was?
Maggie L. Walker. She was St. Luke's Bank, and so she was like a Black banker. It was from here in Richmond, Virginia.
Oh, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, there were, I tried to talk about this, the epilogue. There were folks that, didn't make it into the story. And, certainly this is not, these six are the only ones. I felt like they were the most representative, and probably within the same, time period, there were, probably dozens and dozens of others. But I tried to tell stories that sort of were representative. But she's somebody who definitely could have been in the book.
I just got another question. They keep coming in. Do you see a time when history will be not black or white, but history accepted by all?
I mean, I think we're figuring that out now. I just think that really depends on whether Americans can, come together. Because we're still, as John Lewis would say, we're one family living in, one house. And Black history is American history, the same way the history of George Washington is American history. And I'm, proud of Abraham Lincoln the same way, anybody can be proud of Mary Ellen Pleasant. So I would love to see a time when we embrace all history as belonging to all of us. But I think that's, TBD, whether we can come together in that way. I certainly hope so.
I hope so too. I love diversity. I believe it makes us stronger and better. I believe that's what the kingdom of God looks like. So when I look out over the congregation at First Baptist Church, we're still pretty white, but not as white as we used to be. And I feel like that's moving in the right direction. So to read books like this, to have these kind of conversations, I think it just makes us value humanity at every level, every color, every struggle, every success. And you've given us some great success stories that have really inspired us. I'm so grateful, Shomari. Thank you for joining us tonight. That was a huge plus. Otherwise, it's going to be David and me. But
well, thank you so much. And I'm always telling, folks how instrumental, the church was in, the, liberation of African Americans and moving this country forward. A lot of people don't know that, John Brown was a pastor. How we feel about John Brown, but, he famously decided, to fight for African Americans because he said, Jesus died for me, so I can sacrifice myself for African Americans. And Frederick Douglass was a pastor, and of course we know Martin Luther King was a pastor. And so Mary Ellen Pleasant was a person of faith. She was a devout Catholic, even though she wasn't really, focused on denomination, but she was very driven by faith. So it's really an honor to be able to speak to, faith community, especially about this book, because I think it's an important part of, how this country has moved forward.
well, thank you very much. You read the Bible all the way through, it doesn't allow for the kind of injustice you see in this country, and we have seen. But my hope and prayer is for a better future than our past. And this kind of conversation moves that along. Your book helps us move that conversation along. So thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. We're grateful to you, and hope you'll come see us when you're in Richmond.
Absolutely. That's a promise. And I'm honored to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. It really means a lot.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Good night. Take care, everybody.
We'll let you go. I'm going to close with prayer, and feel free to stick around, ask each other your good questions, and we'll end this way tonight. Let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for Shomari Wills and for his work, his ability to tell a good story, and one that really does raise the kind of important questions we need to be considering. Thank you for this group of people in the room tonight and those who have been watching the webcast and others who may tune in later and watch the recorded event and learn from it. We hope that many, many people will buy the book and read it and learn from those stories and think about how we create opportunities for everybody in a country like this one. We thank you for the good news of the gospel, which is truly liberating. The news that every human being is made in God's image, that God's seal, the divine seal, is pressed down into the soft wax of the human soul at the time of creation. And each one of us is precious to you. Help us to see others in that way, to look for your image in each one, and to celebrate the diversity of humanity. For we ask it all in the name of Jesus, who didn't look exactly like most of us, but who died to save all of us. In his name we pray. Amen. Thank you.
Amen.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you
night,
again.
Shomari.